After Iran-backed rebels took over the capital of Yemen back in 2014, the then 30-year-old Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman spearheaded a military intervention. With American assistance, the Saudi military embarked on a bombing campaign called Operation Decisive Storm. Saudi Arabia was hoping to swiftly defeat the rebels who fashioned themselves as a ragtag tribal militia known as the Houthis. Instead, Saudi Arabia and its Gulf partners, including the UAE and Bahrain, spent the better part of the next 8 years mired in this conflict. It drained billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia's coffers. It helped plunge Yemen into one of the world's biggest crises. Hundreds of thousands of people died from the unchecked violence that resulted in the deaths of not just Yemeni civilians, but also Saudi and Emirati military personnel. Saudi Arabia and its main partner, the United Arab Emirates, eventually scaled back their military involvement, partly because of American pressure.
اليوم أعلنت قيادة التحالف أنها أنهت عمليات عاصفة الحزم بناء على طلب الحكومة اليمنية، بناء على طلب فخامة الرئيس الذي رأى أن الأهداف الأساسية لعاصفة الحزم حققت.
The Saudi officials entered into peace talks with the Houthis. The Houthis by then had secured control of all of northern Yemen. Now, the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas has thrust the Houthis into an unlikely global spotlight. They have been repeatedly targeting Israeli as well as Western ships which use the Red Sea shipping lanes. It has become such a big headache for the United States and its allies that this past week the US and UK have hit multiple targets inside Yemen. This is the first escalation of this 3-month-long war between Israel and Hamas. But Saudi Arabia and the UAE would rather watch these latest developments from the sidelines. Neither country has issued a statement supporting the American military campaign. On Crux Decode, we explain why for Saudi Arabia and the UAE this happens to be a strategic calculation. Saudi Arabia is placing more importance on peace at its southern border with Yemen rather than joining an effort to stop the attacks against the Houthis. And part of the reason is the Houthis have framed these Red Sea attacks as directed against Israel, a country which is the most hated in the entire Arab world. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is now the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. He is uninterested in getting dragged back into a conflict with the Houthis. As MBS rushes to make progress on his sweeping reforms to try and transform Saudi Arabia into a global business hub by 2030, he has been working hard to reduce conflicts and tensions across the Middle East. Saudi officials say that the return of the Houthi missiles soaring over Riyadh or striking the southern part of Saudi Arabia, which used to be a relatively common occurrence at the height of the Yemen war, that is the last thing that Crown Prince MBS wants to see as he tries to convince tourists and investors that the kingdom is open for business. The new Saudi strategy in Yemen, which leans away from any kind of direct military action, is driven by the reality that after 8 years of war, the Houthis have effectively won in Yemen. As fighting has now quietened down, the Houthis, who espouse a religious ideology that's inspired by a subsect of Shia Islam, they have settled into power in northern Yemen. In half of that country, they have established an impoverished proto-state which rules with an iron fist. Last month, the de facto Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi had issued an ominous warning. He said if the United States sends soldiers into Yemen, then its troops will face a conflict that is worse than the long-drawn wars in Afghanistan and Vietnam.
فيما إذا كان لدى الأمريكي التوجه أن يصعد أكثر وأن يورط نفسه أكثر أو أن يرتكب حماقة بالاستهداف لبلدنا أو بالحرب على بلدنا، فلن نقف مكتوف الأيدي. سنستهدفه هو، سنجعل البارجات الأمريكية والمصالح الأمريكية وكذلك الحركة الملاحية الأمريكية هدفا لصواريخنا وطائراتنا المسيرة وعملياتنا العسكرية.
And that is exactly what has happened. America and Britain have now attacked multiple targets inside Yemen over the last few days. This in a bid to try and deter the Houthis from attacking commercial ships that are crossing the Red Sea. But those attacks seem to be having the opposite effect. The Houthis appear to have seized on the Gaza conflict as a chance to further one of their central aims: death to America, death to Israel, and curse upon Jews. That is part of the Houthi slogan. And the Houthis have portrayed their attacks on commercial ships as a righteous battle to try and enforce Israel to end its siege of Gaza. The Houthis are also an important arm of Iran's axis of resistance. That, of course, includes multiple armed groups across the Middle East, including the likes of Hezbollah and Hamas, but the Houthis are a critical component in that. In his speech before the United States-led attacks began, al-Houthi, the leader of the Houthis, demanded that other Arab countries step aside and let the Americans and Israelis enter into a direct war with the Houthis. This is what he said, and I quote, "If you want to dance on the bodies of victims, then dance, but do not participate with the Americans in a war against us," unquote. This was clearly a veiled message to both Riyadh and to Abu Dhabi. And now both countries are sitting out of this war. For the Houthis, the US-led war against them is a golden opportunity to fulfill their narrative. It will enable them to easily recruit and gain credibility amongst their own people. That is particularly true as Israel's bombardment of Gaza, which continues up until this day. It's been 3 months. This, of course, was launched in response to the deadly Hamas terrorist strikes on the 7th of October. But in these last 3 months, the Israeli attacks have sparked huge amounts of grief and anger around the entire Middle East. So the Houthi response is not just aimed at Israel, but also at the United States, which is Israel's biggest ally in the region. Before the war in Gaza began, the Houthis were on the verge of signing an American and Saudi-backed peace deal that would potentially entrench their position in power. Now, if that deal came through, it would have allowed the international community to declare the beginning of the end of the war in Yemen. Amid these negotiations with the Houthis, Saudi Arabia has also continued to cultivate a warmer relationship with Iran, its longtime enemy in the region. President Ibrahim Raisi of Iran made his first visit to Riyadh in November of last year. This week, the United States announced major attacks inside Yemen, this in a bid to try and address the threat posed by the Houthis in the Red Sea. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were not among the members of that coalition. In fact, the only Arab nation that seemed supportive was Bahrain, where this move has sparked popular anger. The United States respects that some countries might have domestic reasons for staying out, according to John Kirby, the White House national security spokesperson. But that does not hide away the fact that the distance between Riyadh and Washington has only grown longer since the start of this war on the 7th of October. And this on the top of rather cold and frosty personal ties between Crown Prince MBS and the US President Joe Biden. Unless there is a dramatic change of events on the ground, expect frostier ties between Riyadh and Washington, and perhaps in the wider Arab world as well.